Rachel Cooper, and today I'm going to give a talk titled Plural Subjects and Social Kinds. In this talk, I give considerations in favor of a different sort of theory of socially constructed kinds. I offer an explanatory critique of the standard debunking proposals. In particular, I argue that standard debunking proposals, or social positional views of the relevant kinds, 1, take on unnecessary metaphysical baggage. 2, do not properly highlight what is unique to covert cases of social construction, the cases of primary interest to debunkers. And 3, do not cover all relevant cases, that is, all cases of covertly socially constructed kinds. The overall aim of my project is to answer the question, how can a kind that seems natural be social? To answer this question, I use Gilbertian plural subjects of a particular sort to give an analysis of the subjects of conceptual schema and of ideology, and then show how these relate to paradigmatic social kinds. For example, race, gender, sex, disability, sexual orientation, and so on. Paradigmatic social kinds on the proposed view are those that feature irregularities that are explained in part by the activities of a plural subject. I argue that the theory covers all the relevant cases and shows what makes them social in an especially important sense, while remaining neutral on the heavyweight metaphysical issues that standard debunking proposals force a stance on. So what is the motivation for neutrality? What if we could answer the debunker's question? That is the question of how can a kind that appears natural be social without requiring commitment on these heavyweight ontological issues? Wouldn't it be nice to explain covert social kinds without this metaphysical baggage? Why? For those who recognize the following is true, but don't like metaphysics, or in particular don't like full-blown realism, or compatibility with a grounding framework, or a commitment to things such as essences. So the benefit is the possibility of wider adoption, as well as avoiding potential drawbacks of those particular metaphysical views the debunker takes on. For each of these ontological commitments, there are reasons one might not want to commit to them. Some novel features of the account I give are that I recommend moving away from the usual focus in the social construction literature on metaphysical explanation or on relations of metaphysical dependence, and moving instead towards giving causal explanations. And 2, I stress the importance of plural subjects and intentionality. In particular, I suggest that Gilbertian plural subjects of a particular sort figure in a mechanistic explanation of regularities observed among members of paradigmatic social kinds. I make a case for thinking that this relationship to social groups or Gilbertian plural subjects is what makes the kinds of interest distinctively social, rather than their being socially constituted. Although they may very well be socially constituted, at least in part, I do not think this is what makes them social in an important or especially interesting sense. So a roadmap for the talk is, first, I will say a bit about what I have in mind when I say debunking style social constructionism. Then I will offer my explanatory critique of social position views. And then I will offer my proposed theory of social kinds. So a bit on debunking style social constructionism. Debunking style social constructionists, or those who offer what are sometimes called social position theories of the kinds of interest, often suggest that what makes such kinds distinctively social is that they are socially constituted. To say that a kind is socially constituted is to say that it cannot be defined without reference to social factors. The debunking social constructionist suggests, more specifically, that the social kinds of interest are akin to social classes that one belongs to in virtue of being taken to have certain features, and where the properties one actually has are irrelevant to kind membership. So on to the explanatory critique of social position views. So I argue that standard debunking proposals or debunking proposals, social position views do not properly highlight what is unique to cases of covert social construction. And in my mind, these are the cases of primary interest to debunkers. If we think of social constitution, a relation of metaphysical dependence, as the defining feature of social kinds, it seems we do not sufficiently single out the kinds of particular interest to the debunker. For instance, this characterization would lead us to include kinds like money, president, judge, point guard, and so on and so forth. I think the phenomena of particular interest to the debunker is when a kind that appears natural is in fact social, as in the case of gender, sex, race, disability, and so on. I think there is a special mechanism at play in the cases of covert social kinds, and this is what I want to focus on capturing. I argue that the debunker takes on unnecessary metaphysical baggage. For one, they seem to commit, in some cases, to a sort of thoroughgoing realism. That's because if we are realists about perceptually individuated social positions and the social structures on which they fall, then it seems we're forced into realism all the way down. That's because it would be odd to be realists about social structure and social positions, but anti-realist about tables and chairs, say. Haslanger argues further that her project, or the debunking project, requires realism. That's because she thinks that in the case of the radical social constructionist who thinks all kinds are socially constructed, you will lose the distinction needed for social change. Part of what I want to do is show that you actually can be anti-realist and engage in the project of explaining how a kind can appear natural but be social. But more on that in a bit. Another seemingly unnecessary metaphysical commitment that falls out of the debunker's proposal is a commitment to social essences. The debunker often suggests that we are required to commit to something like a social essence in order to make true generalizations about, for example, race and gender kinds. The cost of this view, however, is that it requires a very heavyweight metaphysical view of kinds. Social kinds, understood in the prominent way as perceptually individuated social classes, might be interpreted as sharing a social essence, an essence composed of a social property that all and only members of that kind share. However, as Ron Mallon has pointed out, not even natural kinds are thought by philosophers of science to share an essence, for example, a species. Rather, they are thought to share a cluster of properties about which we can make reliable predictions. In addition to taking on unnecessary metaphysical baggage, this view that relies on real perceptually individuated social positions doesn't actually seem to cover all the relevant cases of covertly socially constructed kinds. So even if it might be the case that the notion of essence could be made very innocuous, although note that the anti-essentialist philosopher still couldn't accept the debunker's explanation. But putting the aim of neutrality aside, can a social position account really cover all the relevant cases? What about generalizations about people assigned female at birth? and about people who sincerely identify as women. If we pick out a collection of individuals with significant overlap in extension and make generalizations about them, they will likely be true generalizations. But in each case, the generalizations do not require essences. And in every case, wouldn't we want to say that many of the regularities are non-inevitable in an important sense? Social essences can explain some stuff, but people assigned a certain sex at birth and people who sincerely identify as a particular gender seem to me to be covertly socially constructed kinds, and yet not social positional kinds. If the aim is to answer how a kind can appear natural but be social, we should cover all of the cases, but social positional essences do not cover all the cases. That is, cases of appearing natural but being social. There may be a lot of reasons to want to avoid essences, but even if they are made perfectly innocuous, social essences do not capture all the kinds of interest. Commitment to real social positions or social essences seems to force one into a thoroughgoing realism. But such social essences do not seem to be required to make the kinds in the vicinity explanatory, that is, kinds. Instead, what is crucial is to show why they are explanatory, to reveal how they are social even though they appear natural. We can, and I think we should, capture the core phenomena when a kind appears natural but isn't, without bifurcating ontology in the way suggested by the debunker. Because what is needed is just to locate a different mechanism. On my view, it could be that all kinds are perceptually individuated, or at least in some sense dependent on us, or it could be that none are. That's because, on my view, individuation conditions are not what distinguishes social kinds from natural ones. Thus, a commitment to social constructionism does not require that we accept a thoroughgoing, although critical, realism. The last point in my explanatory critique is that the debunker seems to take on metaphysical baggage that might be counterproductive to the aims of the debunker, such as a compatibility with a grounding framework. It seems that non-mentalistic accounts of the phenomena of interest, for example, those that focus on countenancing real social structures, allow the phenomena of interest to collapse into natural structures. Take Kate Ritchie's account of social groups. On her account, social groups are nodes within social structures that are realized by networks of relations among social animals. It seems to me that on Ritchie's account, the social structures within which social groups occupy nodes are not sufficiently distinguished from ordinary or perfectly natural structures. For instance, Ritchie compares social structure with the molecular structure of table salt. For instance, only certain kinds of atoms can occupy the nodes or positions in the structure of table salt, just as only individuals with certain properties can occupy the nodes or positions in a social structure. I have a worry that an account that allows for the comparison of these radically different things can capture the deep contingency that is the crucial insight of social constructionism. If social kinds and or social groups, I'm not here going to get into the difference, are grounded in social structures, and social structures are grounded in chemical structures somewhere down the line, and those are grounded in atomical structures and so on and so forth, then there is a worry about how sincere we can be about the causal efficacy of social groups. More on that in a moment. So in conclusion to this first part of my talk, debunkers can be neutral on whether there are essences. They can hold that there are natural and social essences. They can hold that all essences are conferred. What is crucial for blocking pernicious generalizations is locating and describing the mechanism that explains how social kinds can appear natural. Debunkers can capture the distinction between natural and social kinds without committing to critical realism or a thoroughgoing realism that Haslinger suggests, so long as they highlight the different mechanisms involved in making social kinds explanatory. It seems to me that debunkers are poorly served by focusing on metaphysical explanations, which fit easily into a grounding framework, which seems to render social phenomena epiphenomenal. Debunkers, I have argued, are best served by focusing on the mechanisms that explain regularities observed among social kinds. This allows for agnosticism about the relationship between levels of explanation. Heavyweight ontological commitments, like those to real social positions, are not necessary to capture the core insight of debunking style social constructionism. What is necessary is locating the mechanism responsible for homeostasis in the cases of interest. Locating a mechanism does not seem to require commitment on these heavyweight ontological issues. So to avoid each of these outcomes discussed simultaneously, I suggest that instead of focusing on relationships of metaphysical dependence or on metaphysical explanation, we focus instead on giving a mechanistic explanation of the deeply contingent regularities of interest to debunkers, and in doing so, explaining how it is that they can appear natural, as I think this is what is crucial to capture with the notion of social construction. So moving on to a sketch of my proposed theory of social kinds. I want to start out by making a distinction between social kinds and social groups. On my view, these are related but importantly distinct phenomena. On my view, a group is a social group if its members jointly accept a covertly normative representation of individuals with a certain cluster of features, and this acceptance explains some of the regularities observed among individuals with that cluster of features. On my view, a kind is a social kind if its members share a certain cluster of features, and if at least some of the regularities observed among members are explained in part by the joint acceptance of a covertly normative representation of the kind associated with that cluster of features. On my view, paradigmatic social kinds share a cluster of perfectly ordinary properties that would merely be disjunctive and so lack inductive potency were it not for the existence of a certain sort of joint commitment, or what is the same, the activities of a social group or plural subject. The term plural subject is used to refer to a given set of persons who are jointly committed. For a given set of persons to be jointly committed is for those persons to agree, either explicitly or implicitly, to act as a body that, for example, believes that P. The given set of persons can be jointly committed to a rule, norm, assumption, and so on, instead of or in addition to beliefs. The agreement to act as a body that, for example, believes that P involves the standing and perhaps the obligation to rebuke those who do not act in accordance with the joint commitments of the group. In this way, we can see how plural subjects might be the partial cause of a given regularity. I think that plural subjects feature in a mechanistic explanation of the regularities that obtain among collections of individuals with a cluster of perfectly ordinary but socially significant properties. To say that a collection of individuals are jointly committed to acting in accordance with a belief, assumption, norm, rule, and so on, is precisely not to say that each individual in that collection is personally so committed. The notion of shared intentionality does not allow that each of those who jointly accept a belief or are otherwise jointly committed merely have a token of the relevant belief, assumption, attitude, and so on. Rather, the notion requires precisely that there is something more than a summation of individual acceptances at play. Shared intention is something other than a summation of individual intentions. I'm particularly interested in plural subjects that jointly accept what I call a covertly normative representation of a kind. A covertly normative representation of a kind is something akin to a dual character concept. for which the descriptive component is a cluster of plausibly explanatory features, which turns out not to be explanatory in and of itself. Instead, the way the idealizing component is acted on in a semi-uniform fashion by the plural subject contributes significantly to the explanatoriness of the kind. Here one might ask what the role of representation is on my view. What if there is no representation? Could the kind exist? Because I'm attempting to answer the question, how can a kind that seems natural be social? I'm able to avoid the worry that there could be social kinds that are not represented. Because I am focused on kinds that seem to be natural but are social, I'm focused only on kinds that we have representations of, since clearly we have views about them being natural. One also might wonder about this phenomena of jointly accepting a representation. Admittedly, it's odd to think about a representation being the content of a joint commitment, but it's not so odd when you think of particular examples. Boys don't cry, girls cross their legs. We see a cluster of features that are represented as natural, and we rebuke those who do not fit the covertly normative representation that we associate with those features. Before concluding, I want to say a little bit about the extensions of groups and kind. Plural subjects, on my view, can be thought of as the subjects of an ideology or of a conceptual framework. I think it's useful to think of these as paradigmatic social groups and to contrast these with social kinds. But I'm okay if people want to use social group in other ways. The important thing is that I'm giving an analysis of the subjects of conceptual schema and of ideology and showing how these relate to kinds. So I don't claim to be having a monopoly on the definition of a social group. Okay, but if you're on board with me using social groups the way I have been as sort of interchangeable with plural subject, let me just clarify that the members of a social kind may very well be members of the very social group or plural subject that plays a role in explaining the extent to which that social kind features and regularities. For instance, a woman may very well be party to the joint acceptance of a covertly normative representation of the kind woman, and thus be a part of the plural subject that partially explains regularities that obtain among women. On my view, women do not form a social group, they form a social kind. They may come to form a social group by jointly accepting a rule, a belief, a norm, and so on, but it is unlikely that such a group would be coextensive with a social kind. So, in conclusion to this section on my proposed theory of social kinds, plural subjects are material objects that have intentionality. They do not straightforwardly collapse into natural structures. That's because it need not be the case that all the individuals that are jointly committed are also personally committed. I think that Gilbertian shared intentionality is a good explanation of regularities that social constructionists are interested in, namely those that are deeply and in a special sense contingent. And it's also not capturable in terms of individual intentions. Thus, my proposal avoids a commitment to social essences while also avoiding ontological collapse. I recommend that what makes the kinds of interest distinctively social is not that they share nothing but a social property or that they are socially constituted, although they may well be in part, but rather that they feature irregularities as a result of the existence of a plural subject. Thank you.